What if the galaxy's most feared warrior had never faced an opponent who fought with their mind instead of muscle? On Meridian's edge, 30,000 spectators watched as Captain Liana took one precise step, just 18 inches, and shattered centuries of combat dogma. She didn't swing a blade. She dissected his technique live, turning the arena into a lecture hall where humanity's intellect became the ultimate weapon. Humanity didn't walk into that arena as warriors, they entered as the punchline to a joke the galaxy had been telling for decades. The term soft shells had become universal shorthand for military incompetence, a cosmic inside joke that didn't need translation across species lines. You could walk into any fleet command center from the Orion Spiral to the Kelvin Expanse and mention humans, and you'd get the same knowing chuckle. Their brief appearances in galactic conflicts had been so tactically unsound they'd achieved near mythological status as examples of what not to do. Diplomatic briefings across the Keith Moran Empire treated human combat prowess as a theoretical impossibility, like discussing the martial capabilities of decorative shrubbery. The Empire's strategists framed this duel not as a contest but as a formality, a ceremonial demonstration of natural hierarchies. Warlord Dracoth's challenge carried the weight of centuries of unchallenged supremacy. It wasn't an invitation to competition, so much as a public dissection scheduled for prime-time viewing. 30,000 beings from a dozen species packed the Meridian's Edge arena, their collective presence humming with anticipation of a swift and brutal spectacle. The air smelled of ozone from energy field projectors and the distinct musk of a dozen different physiologies, all keyed up for entertainment. In the luxury boxes, ambassadors placed final wagers not on whether Dracoth would win, but on how many seconds the confrontation might last. The odds favored something under 10. The betting slips weren't even printed with human victory as a measurable probability. They came to witness confirmation of the established galactic order, not its potential upheaval. The crowd's murmurs took on a particular tone when Liana made her walk to the combat floor, a mixture of pity and derisive amusement that needed no translation. A Xanthian diplomat was overheard remarking that they should have provided human-sized medical facilities, as if acknowledging the inevitable cleanup operation. The Catharan delegation didn't even bother watching her entrance, instead reviewing ceremonial victory protocols on their data slates. The apparent mismatch wasn't merely physical, it represented a clash of entire philosophies of war. On one side stood millennia of perfected violent tradition, on the other what appeared to be a biological entity that had somehow missed every evolutionary memo about survival through force. The audience saw only what their biases had prepared them to see. Another soft shell about to learn why the galaxy had written them off as tactical non-entities. But the crowd's assumptions were precisely what Liana intended to dismantle. She moved with a calm that read as resignation to those expecting fear, her posture suggesting not preparation for combat but for observation. The arena's lights gleamed off Dracoth's polished armor, while Liana's simple combat suit absorbed it, as if she'd arrived not to reflect glory but to study it. Where others saw inevitable defeat, she saw a data set about to perform its final demonstration. The entertainment monitors began their countdown sequence, the numbers flashing in a dozen different numeric systems. 30,000 beings leaned forward as one, anticipating the satisfying crunch of definitive proof that some species simply weren't built for this kind of work. They were about to get their proof, just not in the form they expected. Warlord Dracoth stood as the final product of Catharan evolutionary combat design, a biological statement about what happens when a species spends 8 centuries perfecting the art of violence. His 8-foot frame wasn't just large, it was engineered, each muscle group optimized for specific kinetic functions that would give human biomechanics experts migraines for weeks. The forearms moved with a coordination that defied everything neurology understood about limb independence, operating like separate combat systems sharing a single ruthless consciousness. You could watch footage of Catharan warriors for hours, and still not comprehend how the neural architecture managed such complex motor functions without catastrophic signal interference. Each of those limbs could execute entirely different combat maneuvers simultaneously, the upper pair launching offensive strikes while the lower set maintained defensive postures. This wasn't the crude swinging of multiple weapons you might see in lesser species. This was precise, calculated violence operating on multiple tactical channels at once. His molten gold eyes scanned opponents not for emotional tells or fear responses, but for structural weaknesses, calculating angles of attack and points of biomechanical failure with cold efficiency. The armor he wore wasn't something put on so much as grown into, an integrated exoskeletal system that moved with his body rather than around it, its plates shifting like the scales of some prehistoric predator. Centuries of uninterrupted victory had refined his technique into what military analysts called a perfect combat algorithm, a set of movements and responses so thoroughly tested and optimized that deviation seemed not just unnecessary but fundamentally illogical. When he announced his intention to fight with bone and steel, strength and skill, it wasn't boasting, but a simple statement of operational parameters. The phrase represented an entire philosophy of conflict that valued overwhelming force above tactical innovation, the kind of thinking that emerges when you haven't lost a fight in 14 generations. To Draketh, Lyanna represented less an opponent and more a procedural requirement, the necessary biological entity that must be processed before victory could be officially recorded. His entire existence served as a monument to the supremacy of power over planning, a walking argument that the best strategy is simply being better at applying violence than whoever stands against you. The Catharan military academies taught that adaptation was what weaker species did when they couldn't dominate through pure capability. Draketh had never needed to adjust his approach because the approach always worked. Why change a winning formula that had conquered 17 systems and humbled 3 spacefaring civilizations? He was the living embodiment of a combat system that had never encountered a problem it couldn't solve through superior application of force. The arena's lighting caught the razor edges of his blades as he settled into his opening stance, each weapon positioned with millimeter precision according to rituals older than human written history. Spectators could see the slight ripple of muscle beneath armor plates as he tested weight distribution, a subtle shifting that spoke of power held in perfect check until release. His breathing pattern remained steady at 12 breaths per minute, the same rate he maintained during meditation, combat, and even while sleeping according to intelligence reports. Every aspect of his presentation communicated that this wasn't just another fight. It was a demonstration of established cosmic truths about strength and hierarchy. He represented the endpoint of a certain kind of thinking, the final evolution of believing that bigger, stronger, and faster would always prevail against cleverness or creativity. The galaxy had dozens of species that fought with ferocity, and hundreds that fought with skill. But the Catharans had perfected the art of fighting with absolute certainty that their way was the only way that mattered. Draketh wasn't just a warrior, he was the physical manifestation of an unchallenged assumption that had governed interstellar conflict for longer than humanity had possessed radio telescopes. Lyanna's preparation began months before she ever set foot on Meridian's edge, a process that looked nothing like the combat drills and weapon training anyone would expect. Her strategy wasn't built in a gym or on a training field. It was constructed in physics laboratories and data centers, using simulation software and biomechanical modeling tools that hadn't existed a generation earlier. While Draketh trained his muscles through centuries-proven combat exercises, Lyanna trained her predictive models, feeding them every scrap of available data until they could anticipate movements before the thought even formed in her opponent's mind. She consumed every available recording of Catharan combat, treating them not like entertainment or intimidation footage, but as scientific papers awaiting peer review. Her analysis sessions involved frame-by-frame breakdowns of movement patterns, energy expenditure calculations, and neuromuscular response mapping that would have bored any traditional warrior to tears. The focus wasn't on their celebrated strength or fearsome reputation, but on the subtle asymmetries their four-armed physiology created, the tiny imbalances and compensations that evolution hadn't quite perfected. Her team mapped weight distribution patterns across different combat stances, identifying how center of gravity shifted when specific limbs moved in particular sequences. They measured leverage points and calculated torque requirements for various attacks, building a comprehensive understanding of the mechanical advantages and limitations inherent in the Catharan form. The most crucial discovery came when they identified consistent millisecond delays between limb movements, tiny neural processing gaps that created predictable patterns in what appeared to be simultaneous motion. Her training involved simulations that calculated probabilities of attack vectors based on stance, previous movements, and even subtle shifts in weight distribution. The software could predict with 87% accuracy which combination of strikes would follow any given opening position, turning what looked like improvisational combat into a decipherable decision tree. She spent weeks practicing responses to thousands of simulated attack patterns until her reactions became automatic, her body learning to move according to statistical probabilities rather than visual cues. The rapier she chose wasn't selected for power or intimidation value. It served as a precise instrument for data collection and response measurement. Its needle-like point could deliver accurate feedback about pressure, angle, and resistance, while requiring minimal energy expenditure, making it perfect for her analytical approach to combat. The weapon's design allowed for precise measurement of deflection forces and counter-pressure testing, turning each potential contact point into a data-gathering opportunity. She entered the arena not to fight a warrior in any traditional sense, but to test a hypothesis about physiological limitations and predictable behavior patterns. Her approach treated the confrontation as the final experimental validation of months of research, rather than a test of strength or skill. The entire engagement framework existed in her mind as a series of conditional statements and probabilistic outcomes, with victory representing successful hypothesis confirmation rather than personal triumph. Her real weapon was a complete physiological map of her opponent that included musculoskeletal structure, neural pathway efficiency ratings, and even metabolic expenditure projections for various combat scenarios. She knew his reaction times, his recovery rates between maximal exertions, and the specific fatigue patterns that would emerge after sustained combat. The data extended down to individual neuron cluster response times, creating what amounted to a complete owner's manual for a Catharan warrior's combat capabilities. The preparation represented a fundamental shift in how one might approach seemingly impossible challenges, not through matching strength with strength, but through understanding the underlying systems well enough to identify their failure points. She hadn't prepared to win a fight so much as she'd prepared to demonstrate why the fight was already over before it began, provided one had done the homework thoroughly enough. The arena became merely the venue where theory would meet practice, with 30,000 witnesses serving as involuntary peer reviewers. The duel began not with the explosive clash spectators expected, but with a minuscule adjustment that almost didn't register as movement at all. Draketh's opening strike followed a pattern documented across 17 systems, a devastating overhead arc designed to end conflicts in a single, spectacular motion. This particular maneuver had earned the nickname System Breaker among military analysts after it once shattered the reinforced armor of a species roughly twice Liana's body mass. The physics involved suggested impact forces equivalent to small vehicle collisions, delivered with precision targeting that left no room for partial defenses. 30,000 beings leaned forward in unison, their collective posture anticipating the visceral crunch of human biology, meeting its absolute structural limit. The sound never came. Liana didn't attempt to block the blow or parry the strike, actions that would have required engaging with the overwhelming force behind it. Instead, she shifted her entire body weight exactly 18 inches to the left, a movement so economical it appeared almost casual. The displacement wasn't a dramatic dodge but a precise recalibration of position, as if she were correcting her stance rather than avoiding annihilation. The air displaced by his weapon's passage rustled loose strands of her hair, the vacuum effect pulling at her combat suit, while the enormous blade rang against the arena floor where she'd stood milliseconds earlier. The sound echoed through the silent amphitheater, not the expected impact of blade meeting flesh but the hollow ring of metal striking reinforced plating in empty space. The movement's minimalism made it appear almost dismissive, like someone sidestepping a puddle rather than avoiding a killing blow. It communicated that the force being deployed wasn't worthy of significant exertion to counter, merely a minor inconvenience requiring slight positional adjustment. This tiny spatial correction served as her first reply to Draketh's declaration of fighting with bone and steel, strength and skill. Where he offered overwhelming power, she responded with geometric precision. The 18 inches represented not just physical distance but conceptual space, the gap between their approaches to conflict itself. She'd calculated the exact parameters of his strike during months of analysis, knowing the weapon's arc, speed, and the precise area of effect down to centimeter-level accuracy. Her movement occupied the mathematical dead zone his attack couldn't reach, the safety margin built into physics itself. In that minimal evasion, she established the fundamental terms of their engagement. The entire confrontation would occur within spaces and timing she determined, turning his strength into a liability rather than an advantage. By refusing to meet force with force, she demonstrated that traditional combat metrics no longer applied. The first move belonged to him according to ritual and expectation, but the first lesson belonged to her, a quiet demonstration that everything he understood about fighting might be fundamentally incorrect. The crowd's murmured confusion began replacing their anticipation, the sound of paradigms shifting in real time. Spectators who expected violence witnessed applied mathematics instead. Those anticipating a demonstration of Catherine's superiority saw human calculation refusing to play by established rules. The arena's energy shifted from blood sport anticipation to something resembling a laboratory demonstration, where the experimental subject was centuries of combat doctrine itself. Draketh's follow-through position left him momentarily overextended, his weight committed to a strike that found no resistance, a vulnerability that wouldn't have mattered, against opponents who thought in terms of blocking rather than evading. Liana's expression remained unchanged throughout. Her focus analytical rather than combative, she appeared to be observing the results of an experiment rather than surviving an attack, her posture suggesting she'd expected this exact outcome. The 18-inch shift became a rhetorical argument delivered through movement, a statement that victory might belong to whoever best understood the equations governing conflict, rather than whoever possessed the greatest capacity for violence. She'd turned the opening exchange into a thesis defense. With the entire galaxy watching, Liana began to narrate her analysis as she moved, her voice calm and measured like an instructor conducting a demonstration. "Excellent form," she noted, as a strike that would have removed her head from her shoulders whistled through empty air where she'd been standing. The comment wasn't sarcastic or mocking. It carried the tone of someone observing a promising but fundamentally flawed student performance. Each vocalization served as a data point in her ongoing assessment, probing for the neurological imbalances his species had learned to work around but never eliminate. She started asking questions aloud, her words punctuating the rhythm of their movement. "Which is your dominant upper limb? Your primary stabilizing arm?" The queries weren't rhetorical. They were diagnostic, each one testing how he processed information under combat conditions. The crowd's initial amusement at her speaking died away, replaced by confused silence at this breach of combat ritual. Traditional arena combat followed strict protocols of silence and focus, with vocalization limited to battle cries or pain responses. Her clinical commentary violated centuries of established spectacle etiquette. She wasn't merely fighting anymore. She was conducting a real-time biomechanical audit, treating his body as a system to be evaluated rather than an opponent to be defeated. Her observations cataloged everything from weight distribution patterns to the micro-expressions that preceded specific attack combinations. "Notice how the tertiary arm consistently lags 0.03 seconds behind the primary during lateral strikes," she remarked, her voice projecting clearly enough for the front rows to hear. The statement sounded less like combat banter and more like a lecture hall observation. Draketh's frustration became visibly evident not because he was taking damage he remained untouched, but because he recognized he was being systematically studied. His attacks grew slightly more aggressive, a subtle tell that he was becoming emotionally engaged despite centuries of combat discipline. The dynamic had shifted from predator and prey to researcher and subject, with the Catharan warrior realizing he was the one under examination. Each of her comments seemed to land with more impact than any physical blow could achieve, eroding his confidence through relentless analysis. The arena's purpose transformed around them, the combat floor becoming less a stage for spectacle and more a laboratory for applied biomechanical science. Spectators found themselves leaning forward not to see bloodshed, but to catch her technical observations, the entire event shifting from entertainment to education. Betting pools and victory celebrations became secondary to understanding what they were witnessing, a complete reappraisal of what combat could even mean when intellect rather than instinct drove the engagement. Liana weaponized insight itself, turning each observation into a psychological round fired into her opponent's certainty. Her words created doubt where none had existed before, introducing variables into an equation he'd believed solved centuries earlier. The confidence that came from hundreds of victorious engagements began to fray under the constant analytical pressure, each comment highlighting another aspect of his technique that wasn't perfect, wasn't optimized, wasn't truly simultaneous. She exposed the tiny compromises and adaptations that underlay what appeared to be flawless combat execution. The crowd's silence grew deeper, the absence of their expected reactions becoming its own form of commentary. Where they'd anticipated cheers or gasps, they offered only rapt attention to this unprecedented violation of combat norms. The spectacle became something far more interesting than blood sport. It became a demonstration of how thoroughly preparation could dismantle presumption, how completely understanding could neutralize advantage. Draketh's attacks continued, but now carried a different energy. The certainty behind them weakened by the growing realization that his opponent saw him, not as a warrior but as a collection of predictable systems and patterns. Liana's research had revealed that forearms don't actually mean 4 times the advantage. They introduce 4 times the complication. Perfect symmetry may look impressive in parades and propaganda reels, but it's a biological myth. Every bilateral organism develops slight imbalances, and Catharans were no exception to the rule. Their nervous system, while impressively advanced, still had to prioritize which limb received commands first. There was always a microscopic delay, undetectable to the untrained eye, between the initiation of movement in the primary and tertiary arms. The limbs didn't swing in perfect unison. They moved in a subtle sequence like musicians in an orchestra who aren't quite following the same conductor. The strength that came with 4 arms also introduced a significant mass management problem. All that additional musculature and bone structure altered the center of gravity in ways that became predictable under analysis. Liana's models had calculated the exact millisecond his lower left arm would lag behind the right during certain combinations, creating temporary blind spots in his defensive coverage. These weren't errors in his technique. They were built-in limitations of his species' physiology, the kind of compromises evolution makes when designing complex biological systems. She began positioning herself within these micro-delays, occupying the spaces his limbs hadn't quite synchronized to protect. Her movements looked less like combat, and more like someone navigating through a constantly shifting architectural space, always finding the safe zones in what appeared to be an impenetrable defense. The patterns became visible once you knew what to look for. The slight stagger in arm movements during lateral strikes, the fractional hesitation before the tertiary arms engaged in complex maneuvers. What appeared as overwhelming offensive capability actually contained rhythmic gaps, like a complex machine with precisely timed moving parts that occasionally fell out of phase. The forearm configuration created vulnerabilities in weight distribution that wouldn't exist in a 2-armed species. Each additional limb required neural resources and metabolic energy that had to be borrowed from somewhere else in the system. Liana's analysis showed that Catharan warriors consistently favored certain arm pairings for specific tasks, creating predictable patterns of over-reliance and underutilization. Their celebrated adaptability was actually a carefully managed compensation for inherent physiological limitations. What evolution had designed as overwhelming power, physics revealed as a complex system of levers and counterweights, requiring perfect coordination to function effectively. The Catharan combat style wasn't the flawless execution it appeared to be. It was a brilliantly engineered workaround for a body plan that introduced as many problems as it solved. The micro-delays weren't failures of training but inevitable consequences of neural architecture, trying to manage too many sophisticated movements simultaneously. Every mechanical system has points where applied pressure causes the entire mechanism to seize up. Liana's approach involved finding those precise pressure points in Draketh's combat style, not through brute force, but through understanding exactly where and when to apply minimal intervention for maximum effect. She treated his celebrated forearm technique not as an unstoppable weapon but as a precisely balanced machine that could be disrupted with the right application of counter-pressure at the right moment. The audience began to see what she saw, the tiny hiccups in movement synchronization, the almost imperceptible adjustments he constantly made to manage his own body mass. What they'd been taught to view as perfection revealed itself as brilliantly managed complexity. with all the vulnerabilities that come with any complicated system. The four arms that had conquered systems were now being systematically analyzed as the collection of levers and pulleys they actually were, complete with all the points where leverage could be applied to make the whole thing stop working. Your species has been using the same basic combat algorithms for centuries, Liana stated, her voice cutting through the rhythmic sounds of weapon movements and displaced air. She framed Catherine warfare not as some mystical art form or cultural expression, but as a repeating, decipherable code that had simply never been thoroughly analyzed before. The statement hung in the arena like an academic correction during a flawed presentation, changing how everyone viewed what they were witnessing. Each of Draketh's attacks represented a sentence in a language she had become completely fluent in through months of intensive study. A feint with the upper right arm always preceded a low sweep from the left by exactly 0.8 seconds, a pattern documented across 17 recorded combat encounters. A defensive posture with the two central arms consistently left a tiny gap near the clavicle for precisely 0.2 seconds, a vulnerability that previous opponents either hadn't noticed or couldn't exploit. The patterns weren't just consistent, they were practically algorithmic, following logical progressions based on stance and previous movements. She wasn't predicting the future through some mystical foresight. She was reading the present a few milliseconds ahead of him, processing visual and auditory cues that signaled his intentions before his muscles fully committed to actions. Her reactions appeared preternatural because she'd mapped the entire decision tree of Catharan combat, understanding which branches followed, which conditions with statistical certainty. The crowd began to see it too, the repetition in his footwork, the subtle tells in his shoulder positioning, the elegant but rigid patterns that underlay what they'd always believed was improvisational genius. Draketh was speaking a language of war that everyone in the galaxy recognized and respected. But Liana was the first to properly grammar check it. She pointed out the inconsistent verb conjugations in his attack combinations and the poorly constructed sentences in his defensive postures. Where others saw poetry in motion, she identified repetitive phrases and cliched expressions that had been recycled through generations of warriors. His movements carried the weight of tradition but lacked the innovation that comes from genuine conversation rather than recitation. His undefeated record stood as testament not to perfection but to conformity, centuries of opponents who had accepted his terms of engagement and tried to outperform him within his established framework. No one had ever fundamentally questioned the language itself, treating Catharan combat as an immutable reality rather than a constructed system with flaws and limitations. They'd attempted to shout louder in a language they barely understood rather than questioning whether there might be better ways to communicate. Liana changed the fundamental game from combat to comprehension, treating the arena as a conversational space where she could introduce new syntactic structures. She responded to his declarative statements with conditional questions, answering his aggressive assertions with logical counterarguments expressed through movement. The physical engagement became secondary to the intellectual exchange, with strikes and parries serving as punctuation in a dialogue about the very nature of conflict. The realization spread through the audience that they weren't watching a breakdown of technique but a demonstration of linguistic analysis applied to physical expression. Spectators began noticing the repetitions they'd previously missed, the patterns that had been hidden in plain sight because everyone accepted them as natural rather than learned behaviors. What appeared as fluid improvisation revealed itself as sophisticated recitation, brilliant in its execution but limited in its vocabulary. Liana's approach suggested that any language, no matter how ancient or revered, could be deconstructed and understood given enough analysis and the willingness to question its fundamental rules. She treated Catharan combat not as some sacred text, but as a communication system that could be decoded, analyzed, and ultimately mastered through systematic study rather than physical emulation. The exchange became less about winning a fight, and more about demonstrating that the fight itself operated on principles that could be understood and manipulated through intellect rather than force. In a moment of absolute clarity, during what should have been chaotic combat, Liana offered what sounded like a trivial personal detail. "I'm right-handed," she stated, the words carrying across the arena with the weight of a confession. For a human, this simple fact dictates weapon choice, fighting stance, and entire schools of combat philosophy. For Draketh, it represented something entirely different. a key to understanding the fundamental difference in how they approached this confrontation. The statement seemed almost absurd in context, a bizarre non sequitur delivered while avoiding a strike that could have removed limbs. His four-armed physiology was specifically engineered to make handedness irrelevant, a concept Catharan military doctrine treated as a primitive limitation of lesser species. Their combat training emphasized ambidexterity and symmetrical capability, considering specialized limb function a weakness to be engineered out of their warriors. But Lyanna's extensive research had uncovered something their propaganda never admitted. Catharan society still subtly favored leading with two specific arms in combat situations. The cultural preference wasn't official doctrine, but it manifested in training patterns, historical combat records, and even the design of their weapons. This cultural bias created an inherent asymmetry in his strength distribution and defensive priorities that wasn't apparent to casual observation. He subconsciously protected what amounted to his dominant side, committing slightly more attention and resources to defending those limbs, even while maintaining the appearance of perfect symmetry. The subtle preference created tiny vulnerabilities on his less favored flank, gaps that would be invisible to anyone who hadn't studied thousands of hours of combat footage with analytical precision. These weren't flaws in his technique so much as artifacts of cultural programming that even he likely didn't recognize in himself. By declaring her own handedness, she was communicating something far more significant than which hand held her weapon. She was telling him exactly how she would map his imbalances, demonstrating that she understood the hidden architecture of his combat style better than he did himself. The psychological impact was more devastating than any physical blow could achieve. She was essentially reading his biological and cultural operating manual back to him, complete with passages he'd never bothered to study. It suggested an intimacy of understanding that transcended the physical confrontation happening between them. She used a human limitation as a lens through which to examine an alien strength, systematically turning that strength into a measurable weakness. Where the Catharans saw their forearm configuration as eliminating the concept of handedness, she recognized it as simply distributing the same inherent asymmetries across a more complex system. The personal detail about her own physiology became the pivotal insight that allowed her to deconstruct his apparently superior design, demonstrating that sometimes understanding your own limitations provides the best framework for understanding others' advantages. The comment reframed their entire engagement from a contest of capabilities to a demonstration of comprehension. She wasn't just fighting someone with different physical attributes. She was showing that those attributes could be analyzed, understood, and ultimately used against their owner. The arena became a classroom where she taught the lesson that self-awareness might be more valuable than additional limbs, that understanding your own design might help you decode others' designs more effectively than raw power ever could. What began as a simple statement about personal physiology ended up revealing the core vulnerability in a combat system that had never considered such trivial human details relevant to interstellar conflict. The apparently insignificant fact of her right-handedness became the key that unlocked understanding of a warrior who considered such concerns beneath notice, demonstrating that sometimes the smallest personal details contain the most universal insights. The moment passed quickly, but its implications would echo through galactic combat doctrine for generations, all starting with a simple observation about which hand someone preferred to use. Draketh's attacks began to lose their legendary precision, transforming from calculated strikes into something closer to desperate flailing. The warrior who had moved with mechanical efficiency moments earlier started resembling a frustrated brawler, his movements growing wilder with each passing second. His greatest asset, overwhelming strength, now worked against him as he overcommitted to every swing, putting more force behind attacks that had less chance of connecting. Each missed strike wasted precious energy reserves while throwing his balanced stance further into disarray, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of deterioration. The crowd watched the undefeated champion begin to stagger, not from physical damage but from sheer confusion, his footwork becoming uncertain as his confidence eroded. He represented a system experiencing critical errors, with Lyanna functioning as source code he couldn't possibly parse or understand. The metaphor became increasingly literal. He was trying to solve an advanced mathematics problem with a hammer, and the numbers stubbornly refused to crack under blunt force application. The spectacle shifted focus from his demonstrated power to its systematic negation, each failed attack demonstrating not his strength but its increasing irrelevance to the situation. Audience members began to understand they weren't witnessing a traditional fight so much as observing an education in real time, with the galaxy's most feared warrior serving as the failing student in a final examination he hadn't prepared for. His berserker tactics, while potentially devastating against multiple opponents or less analytical fighters, sacrificed all precision for raw power against this particular opponent. The approach that might have worked against panicked foes became predictably ineffective against someone who understood the underlying mechanics of his rage. Liana recognized that his frustration made him more predictable, not less. As he abandoned disciplined strategy for emotional responses, she capitalized on his overcommitment by redirecting his momentum and exploiting the openings created by his desperate maneuvers. The transition from calculated warrior to frustrated brawler marked the critical turning point where his defeat became inevitable rather than merely possible. His predictability increased exponentially as emotional responses replaced tactical thinking, turning what should have been an advantage into the source of his downfall. Her strategy extended beyond simply anticipating his initial attacks. She predicted and countered his adaptations to her tactics as well. She exploited not only his current movements but also the adjustments he made to compensate for his growing frustration and the evolving dynamics of their engagement. This ability to stay ahead of his reactions amplified his confusion and accelerated his deterioration, keeping him constantly one step behind in a game he thought he was playing. The crowd's reaction shifted from anticipation to dawning realization about what they were actually witnessing. The initial excitement gave way to something closer to academic interest as they understood this wasn't about physical prowess, but about applied intelligence and pattern recognition. The atmosphere in the arena transformed from bloodsport excitement to something resembling a lecture hall where the subject was being systematically demonstrated rather than merely described. Draketh's loss of composure became increasingly visible through his deteriorating technique and frustrated vocalizations. Each wild swing that connected only with air seemed to frustrate him more than the last, creating a feedback loop where poor performance led to worse decisions. The champion, who had never needed to adapt because his approach always worked, now faced someone who refused to play by his established rules, leaving him without a fallback position or alternative strategy. The education continued as his movements became even more desperate, each failed attack serving as another lesson in why brute force fails against proper analysis. The student wasn't just failing the exam, he was demonstrating exactly why the curriculum needed updating, with 30,000 beings watching his real-time evaluation. His berserker rage, rather than intimidating his opponent, simply provided more data points for her ongoing analysis, turning his emotional response into another variable to be measured and countered. Liana's strategy shifted decisively from analysis to practical application, transforming Draketh's overwhelming force into the very weapon that would dismantle him. She stopped merely dodging his attacks and began actively redirecting them, her movements evolving from evasion to strategic guidance of his own limbs against himself. Each powerful swing he unleashed became an opportunity to disrupt his balance through subtle shifts in leverage, turning his momentum into her tactical advantage. She never attempted to meet his strength directly. Instead, she chaperoned it harmlessly into empty air or redirected it back into his own body, making his power work against him. This transition marked where months of physics modeling became physical reality, her calculations of mass and velocity translating into precise manipulations of his movements. A grab intended to crush her arm became subtly twisted into a joint lock that strained his own tendons. The pressure points she targeted chosen based on extensive anatomical research rather than brute force. His attacks, once considered overwhelming demonstrations of superiority, now served only to exhaust his energy reserves while tightening her tactical control over the engagement. He found himself trapped in a destructive feedback loop, where every exertion contributed to his own degradation, each failed strike leaving him more fatigued and less coordinated. The elegance of her approach lay in its economy. She achieved control through minimal intervention at precisely calculated moments, rather than through competing force against force. Her redirections required fractions of the energy his attacks expended, making her increasingly efficient as he grew progressively more fatigued. The principle became unmistakably clear. She was winning the confrontation without delivering a single attack powered by her own strength. Victory would be achieved not through superior force but through superior understanding of how to manipulate existing forces. Spectators witnessed the bizarre spectacle of a combatant prevailing by making her opponent's efforts increasingly counterproductive. Draketh's exhaustion became visible through slowing reaction times and decreasing precision in his movements, the fatigue compounding with each unsuccessful attack. His breathing grew labored while Liana's remained steady, the physiological contrast highlighting the difference between their approaches. Where he expended energy, she conserved it. Where he forced outcomes, she guided them. The tactical noose tightened gradually but inexorably, each redirected attack narrowing his options and reducing his effectiveness. His frustration mounted as he recognized that his traditional responses produced diminishing returns against someone who refused to engage on conventional terms. The warrior who had never needed a Plan B found himself without answers when Plan A not only failed, but actively worked against him. His confidence, once his greatest asset, became another vulnerability, as he struggled to comprehend why centuries of proven techniques had suddenly become liabilities. Liana's movements took on an almost instructional quality, demonstrating principles of leverage and momentum that transcended species or physiology. She showed that strength alone means little without proper application. That power uncontrolled becomes self-defeating. The arena became a demonstration of physics in action, with Draketh serving as the subject through which fundamental principles were illustrated. His exertions provided the energy that powered her strategy, his movements the raw material she shaped into his defeat. The resolution approached not with a dramatic climax, but with the inevitable conclusion of a process that had been set in motion from the first exchange. She would be crowned victor not through her own exertion, but through the systematic redirection of his, proving that understanding can triumph over force when properly applied. The defeated would essentially crown the victor through his own unsuccessful efforts, a concept that would redefine galactic combat philosophy for generations to come. The lesson extended beyond the physical confrontation to question fundamental assumptions about what constitutes strength and how it should be measured and applied. The dismantling moved from psychological warfare to physiological intervention as Liana's rapier tip began finding targets that weren't arteries or armor gaps, but neural pathways. These strikes represented a fundamental shift in combat philosophy. Precise, non-lethal impacts designed to disrupt signal transmission rather than cause structural damage or fluid loss. Each contact served as a temporary interruption to motor function, a carefully calculated interference with the biological machinery controlling movement. The approach demonstrated that disabling an opponent didn't require destruction, merely temporary system interruption. A precisely placed tap to his shoulder joint caused his lower left arm to twitch and go momentarily slack, the limb dropping as if its control cables had been temporarily severed. Another impact near the wrist deadened the grip in his primary weapon hand, forcing adjustments that disrupted his combat rhythm. Each strike represented another component taken offline, another system temporarily disabled, through understanding of Catherine neurophysiology. The effect was cumulative rather than immediately decisive, a gradual degradation of capabilities that left the underlying structure intact but increasingly non-functional. She was demonstrating the ability to disable the biological machine without breaking its essential components, showing control that extended beyond winning to governing exactly how victory would be achieved. The clinical detachment of her approach proved more unsettling than any display of berserker rage could have been. It suggested a level of understanding that made emotional responses unnecessary. Her precision communicated that she knew exactly what she was doing and required no emotional reinforcement to continue doing it effectively. This neurological intervention proved her control was absolute and the outcome represented choice rather than chance. She wasn't lucky to be landing strikes. She was selecting which functions to disrupt based on strategic priorities. The nerve clusters she targeted weren't random. They represented critical control points that her research had identified as vulnerabilities in Catherine physiology. Each successful strike validated months of anatomical study and simulation work, turning theoretical knowledge into practical application. Mercy was being established not through pleading or negotiation, but through demonstration of undeniable superiority. By choosing non-lethal disablement over lethal force, she communicated that his survival depended on her decisions rather than his capabilities. The approach created a power dynamic where continued functioning required her permission, a reality that became increasingly apparent with each temporarily disabled limb. She wasn't just winning the fight, she was demonstrating that she could choose exactly how winning would look. The precision required for these strikes reflected months of preparation by xenobiologists who had mapped Catharan nervous systems down to individual nerve bundles. They had identified vulnerabilities at specific joints where neural pathways passed through gaps in the armor, calculating exact angles and force levels needed for temporary disruption without permanent damage. This scientific approach to combat represented humanity's fundamental difference in thinking, treating warfare as another system to be understood and manipulated rather than merely participated in. The psychological impact of these strikes exceeded their physical effects, demonstrating that she understood his body's operation better than he did. Each temporary disablement served as a reminder that she could have chosen permanent damage, but was exercising restraint. This calculated mercy became another form of psychological pressure, creating uncertainty about whether the next strike would be another temporary interruption or something more definitive. The approach kept him off balance both physically and mentally, never certain what each new contact would accomplish. Her control extended to selecting which functions to disrupt, based on tactical needs, rather than simply targeting whatever was available. She prioritized strikes that would maximize disruption to his combat effectiveness, while minimizing risk of accidental permanent damage. This selective targeting demonstrated that her understanding included not just how to disable him, but which disablements would be most effective at specific moments. The surgical precision turned combat into a form of biological engineering, with his body as the system being carefully recalibrated into non-functionality. The resolution of this approach proved that absolute control could be achieved through understanding rather than force, that victory could be engineered through precise intervention rather than overwhelming power. Each nerve strike represented another data point in her ongoing demonstration that humanity's approach to conflict involved different tools and different thinking. The clinical nature of the disablements made them more intimidating than any display of brute force could have been, revealing that true control comes from knowing exactly what you're doing and why. The climax arrived not with some dramatic killing blow, but through a perfectly orchestrated geometric trap that looked less like combat and more like applied physics. Liana guided Draketh's own momentum through a sequence of minimal parries and deflections, each movement calculated to channel his energy along specific vectors. She wasn't fighting him anymore so much as she was conducting his movements, turning his attacks into components of her final maneuver. The entire engagement had been building toward this moment, with each previous exchange serving as data points that informed her ultimate solution to the problem he represented. His final, desperate lunge contained all the frustration and deteriorating technique of the preceding minutes, a committed forward motion that sacrificed defense for the chance to finally connect with something. She anticipated the movement not through psychic ability, but through understanding the statistical probability of his choices under mounting pressure. The lunge represented his last resort, the kind of high-risk maneuver warriors attempt when conventional tactics have failed completely. She channeled the attack not by opposing it, but by aligning with its direction, making his momentum work for her rather than against her. She caught his wrist not with muscular strength but through a precise application of leverage and impeccable timing, her grip positioned at the exact point where mechanical advantage outweighed physical power. His own strength and forward momentum did the actual work, driving his blade in an arc that ended not where he intended, but exactly where she directed it. The weapon traveled along a path she had calculated through months of study, its edge following geometric principles rather than combat instincts. The movement achieved what months of simulation had predicted, perfect control through understanding rather than force. The blade's tip came to rest not through armor or flesh, but precisely above his primary heart, the point hovering with millimeter accuracy over the most vulnerable spot in his anatomy. The positioning demonstrated absolute control. She could have ended things at any moment but chose this specific configuration for maximum psychological impact. The move achieved a kind of devastating lyricism in its execution, a perfect equation expressed through motion that resolved with his own weapon, poised to deliver the killing stroke. It represented the culmination of everything she'd been demonstrating throughout their engagement. The arena fell into complete silence, 30,000 beings holding their collective breath at the elegant finality of the moment. The only sounds were Draketh's labored breathing and the faint hum of the energy field containing the combat area. The spectacle had transformed from entertainment to something approaching reverence, the audience understanding they were witnessing not just a victory, but a redefinition of what victory could mean. The tension came not from uncertainty about the outcome, but from anticipation of how it would be resolved. The fight had effectively ended in that moment. All that remained was the choice about how to acknowledge that conclusion. Victory became a question of acknowledgement rather than violence, a shift in perspective that changed everything about how the outcome would be perceived. The resolution wouldn't come through further combat, but through recognition of the situation's reality. Liana held the position without additional pressure, demonstrating that the final move belonged to her opponent despite her control of the circumstances. The geometry of the moment created a perfect equilibrium, where any movement from either participant would determine the outcome. Her stillness communicated that the next action must come from him, that she had done her part and now awaited his decision. The arena's silence stretched, becoming another factor in the equation, increasing the psychological pressure on the warrior who had never faced this particular kind of defeat. The moment stretched from seconds into what felt like minutes, the suspended blade representing not just physical threat, but the weight of an entire combat philosophy being evaluated and found wanting. Liana spoke one word into the waiting silence, the sound carrying across the arena with unexpected clarity: yield. The word hung in the air, its simplicity contrasting with the complex confrontation that had preceded it. This wasn't delivered as a taunt or challenge, but as a statement of fact, an offering of dignity that provided a path to survival consistent with his own warrior code. The choice reflected understanding of his culture's values rather than contempt for them, demonstrating that she comprehended the rules of this engagement better than he did. To yield meant accepting a place in the natural order as the duel's regulations decreed, acknowledging that the outcome had been decided through proper channels. The concept held particular weight in Catharan society, where surrender under honorable circumstances carried less shame than dishonorable victory. For a moment, the entire galaxy seemed to hold its breath as the undefeated warlord grappled with a reality he'd never imagined facing. The spectacle had transformed from entertainment to something approaching historical moment, with 30,000 witnesses understanding they were watching more than just a fight's conclusion. He stood at the crossroads of mythology and reality, facing the choice between preserving his undefeated legend through death or redefining his species' understanding through survival. Death would cement his story as the warrior who never fell, maintaining the myth of Catharan invincibility at the cost of his existence. Life would require acknowledging that everything they believed about combat might need reevaluation, that their entire philosophy of conflict might contain fundamental flaws. The decision extended beyond personal pride to species identity, making the moment about more than just one warrior's record. He looked at the human who hadn't beaten him with superior strength or faster reflexes, but with something far more unsettling, undeniable truth. Her victory hadn't come from matching his capabilities, but from understanding them completely, from seeing patterns and vulnerabilities where others saw only power. The intelligence behind her approach, the restraint in her actions, and the brutal calculus that had systematically dismantled his combat style, all pointed to a different way of thinking about conflict entirely. She represented not a better warrior, but a different kind of problem solver. The word that finally emerged carried the weight of seismic shift, its syllables echoing through the silent arena. I yield to the human champion. The statement sounded less like admission of defeat and more like correction of understanding, as if he were acknowledging a mathematical truth rather than accepting personal failure. The phrasing maintained his dignity while conceding the outcome, following the formal protocols of duel resolution, but inflecting them with new meaning. The natural order hadn't been overturned so much as recalibrated through better data and improved analysis. His surrender represented the culmination of everything Liana had demonstrated throughout their engagement, that understanding could triumph over tradition, that preparation could outperform power, that intelligence could overcome instinct. The moment extended beyond the personal to the philosophical, challenging centuries of galactic assumptions about what constituted military capability. The arena's silence broke into a wave of reactions that ranged from shocked disbelief to dawning comprehension, the sound of paradigms shifting in real time. The resolution demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful move involves knowing when to stop, when the point has been made, and further action becomes unnecessary. Her choice to offer yield rather than enforce victory reflected strategic thinking that extended beyond the immediate conflict to the larger implications of their engagement. She understood that how she won would matter as much as whether she won, that the aftermath would influence galactic perceptions more than the combat itself. The approach showed foresight that conventional warriors often lacked, considering not just the battle but what came after. The natural order had been mathematically recalibrated through better understanding of the variables involved. What appeared to be a fixed hierarchy revealed itself as a system that could be analyzed and optimized, with humanity demonstrating they possessed the tools to do exactly that. The yield represented not an ending, but a new beginning. The start of a different conversation about strength, strategy, and what truly determines victory in conflict. The galaxy would never view warriors or warfare quite the same way again, all because of one word spoken into the right silence at the right moment. Draketh's next words weren't for Liana or the crowd, they were for the microphones, for the recording devices, for the entire galaxy listening in real time. The statement emerged with formal precision, carrying the weight of centuries of diplomatic protocol. The Catharan Empire recognizes humanity as a warrior species. The words hung in the arena's suddenly silent space, their implications rippling outward through communication networks and diplomatic channels across known systems. This wasn't just concession, it was recalibration of interspecies, relations on a scale nobody had anticipated. The declaration upended decades of established diplomatic precedent in 7 carefully enunciated syllables. Humanity's status transformed instantaneously from galactic joke to peer competitor, the shift happening so abruptly that betting slips scattered across the arena floor became historical artifacts rather than gambling receipts. Briefing room jokes that had circulated for generations about soft shells suddenly required new punchlines, the old assumptions rendered obsolete by a single combat demonstration. The laughter that had once greeted human diplomatic initiatives would henceforth be replaced by careful analysis and strategic consideration. The Keith Moran Empire's challenge had backfired spectacularly, their attempt to publicly humiliate humanity instead gifting their opponents legitimacy they'd been seeking for decades. What was intended as a ceremonial demonstration of natural hierarchies became an unexpected platform for human capability. The Empire's strategists had miscalculated by viewing the conflict through their own cultural lens, expecting physical dominance to prevail as it always had. They failed to account for an opponent who treated combat as an intellectual exercise rather than a test of strength. Liana had fought not merely for personal victory, but for diplomatic recognition, understanding that the arena represented a faster path to negotiation leverage than years of tedious diplomatic meetings. Her approach demonstrated that sometimes the most effective diplomacy happens through demonstrated capability rather than skilled negotiation. The victory secured humanity a seat at tables they'd previously been excluded from, their status suddenly reevaluated based on practical demonstration rather than prejudicial assumptions. The tactical victory in the arena produced strategic consequences that would echo through galactic politics and power structures for generations. Military analysts across 17 systems began reevaluating their assessment of human capabilities, understanding that they'd been measuring the wrong metrics entirely. The focus shifted from physical strength and weapon technology to analytical capacity and adaptive thinking, a fundamental redefinition of what constituted military effectiveness. One fight had effectively rewritten the rules of engagement for an entire species, demonstrating that victory could be achieved through unconventional means that bypassed traditional strength-based assessments. The spectacle showed that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the largest gun, but the best understanding of how systems actually work. Galactic strategic doctrine would never be quite the same after analysts finished studying the footage, with military academies adding new courses on analytical combat and pattern recognition. The crowd's roar that followed wasn't just celebration of an upset victory, It was acknowledgement of paradigm shift, the sound of collective understanding being recalibrated in real time. Spectators understood they'd witnessed something more significant than a combat sports outcome. They'd seen demonstrated proof that established hierarchies could be challenged through intellect rather than force. The energy in the arena shifted from entertainment to historical witness, with beings across species recognizing they'd just watched diplomatic history being made through unconventional means. The resolution demonstrated that in galactic relations, as in combat, sometimes the most effective approach involves changing the fundamental terms of engagement rather than simply playing the existing game better. Humanity hadn't just won a fight. They'd changed how the game itself would be played moving forward, introducing new variables that other species would need to account for in their strategic planning. The diplomatic earthquake's aftershocks would be felt across negotiation tables and military strategy sessions for years, all originating from one carefully calculated demonstration in a combat arena. Liana's final statement reframed the entire purpose of human strategy with chilling precision. "We don't just fight to win, we fight to survive." The words carried across the silent arena, their simplicity belying the complex calculation behind them. This wasn't some sentimental declaration of moral superiority. It was a cold statement of operational parameters that redefined what victory even meant. The approach shifted focus from immediate triumph to long-term species preservation, treating individual conflicts as moves in a much larger game. And sometimes survival requires making choices that others might call mercy. The qualification transformed what could have been perceived as weakness into something far more unsettling. This wasn't about compassion or ethical considerations. It was about strategic positioning that extended beyond the current confrontation. The choice to spare Draketh represented not a failure of resolve, but a demonstration of superior calculation, showing that humanity's thinking operated on longer time frames than traditional warrior cultures comprehended. This concept of mercy, in her specific context, functioned as the ultimate form of leverage. It created obligations and redefined relationships in ways that outright victory never could. Killing the warlord would have made her a dangerous anomaly, a statistical outlier to be studied and eventually neutralized. Sparing him made humanity a strategic power, positioning them as calculated actors rather than unpredictable threats. The decision demonstrated thinking that extended beyond the immediate fight to consider diplomatic repercussions, trade negotiations, and colonization rights that would follow this moment. The restraint shown wasn't born from hesitation or uncertainty, but from absolute confidence in their position. It proved that humanity's intellect could govern its power, a far more terrifying prospect for potential opponents than simple brute force. An enemy who fights with overwhelming strength can be met with greater strength, but an opponent who calculates every move, including when not to strike, represents a different kind of challenge entirely. The approach suggested that humanity had moved beyond thinking in terms of individual conflicts to considering systemic relationships and long-term consequences. She revealed that sometimes the most powerful move is the one you consciously choose not to make. This strategic restraint, born from certainty rather than weakness, became her most devastating weapon in the broader context of galactic politics. The decision to spare rather than destroy created a debt that would influence Catharan human relations for generations, establishing a dynamic where mercy became a strategic asset rather than sentimental weakness. It demonstrated that true power lies not in what you can do, but in what you choose to do with your capabilities. The galactic community watching understood they were witnessing something beyond mere combat prowess. They saw a species that had mastered not just how to win fights, but how to win the peace that follows. This approach to conflict resolution, using victory to create future advantages rather than simply demonstrate current superiority, represented an evolutionary leap in strategic thinking. Other warrior cultures fought for honor or dominance. Humanity fought for positioning in a complex interstellar landscape where survival depended on more than battlefield victories. Restraint became the ultimate demonstration of control, proving that humanity could achieve their objectives without unnecessary destruction. This calculated mercy showed they understood something fundamental about power dynamics that other species had overlooked, that sometimes the strongest position comes from leaving your opponent alive but obligated. The approach transformed what could have been a simple combat victory into a diplomatic masterstroke, achieving through single combat what might have taken decades of negotiation. The lesson extended beyond the arena to challenge fundamental assumptions about strength and strategy across the galaxy. Military analysts would spend years debating the implications of treating mercy as leverage and restraint as weaponry. The concept that sometimes not striking could be more powerful than striking represented a paradigm shift in how conflicts might be approached moving forward. Humanity hadn't just won a fight. They'd introduced a new variable into galactic strategic calculations, one that valued long-term positioning over immediate satisfaction. The resolution demonstrated that true strategic advantage comes from understanding not just how to defeat opponents, but how to transform them into assets. By choosing mercy, Liana turned a defeated enemy into a living testament to human capability and restraint, a walking advertisement for their unique approach to conflict. The warlord's continued existence would serve as constant reminder that humanity could have destroyed him, but chose not to, creating psychological leverage that extended far beyond what his death could have accomplished. In the immediate aftermath, analysts from a dozen species began the systematic autopsy of the fight, their focus shifting from physical spectacle to intellectual architecture. They weren't studying Liana's strength or speed. They were reverse engineering her thought processes, treating the combat footage as a cryptographic puzzle rather than a martial display. The recording underwent frame-by-frame analysis across multiple military research facilities, each species bringing their unique analytical perspectives to bear on what they'd witnessed. The approach represented a fundamental shift in how galactic powers evaluated threats, moving from physical metrics to cognitive capabilities. The footage was scrubbed for the specific data points that informed her predictive model, each movement and decision treated as variables in a complex equation. They saw the initial 18-inch shift not as a simple dodge but as the first executable line of code in an entirely new combat program. This minimal movement represented the opening statement in her argument against centuries of combat doctrine, a precisely calculated response that established the terms of engagement from the outset. The analysis revealed that what appeared reactive was actually deeply proactive, each evasion part of a larger strategic framework. Her battlefield, compliments, and observational comments were reclassified as psychological operations, designed to elicit specific responses rather than casual commentary. Phrases like excellent form and queries about limb dominance were identified as calculated interventions meant to probe neurological responses and disrupt combat rhythm. The psychological component of her strategy received as much analytical attention as the physical, with xenopsychologists mapping how verbal interventions influenced Dryketh's decision-making under stress. The approach revealed that combat could be treated as a form of conversational exchange, where words served as tactical instruments. The concept of pattern recognition evolved from incidental skill to formal military science across galactic institutions. Academies that had previously focused on physical training and weapons mastery introduced new curricula centered on predictive modeling and behavioral analysis. The ability to anticipate opponent movements became a measurable competency rather than intuitive talent, with training simulations increasingly emphasizing pattern identification over reflex development. Military doctrine expanded to include cognitive warfare as a distinct discipline alongside traditional combat training. Humanity's galactic reputation underwent seismic recalibration, the dismissive soft shells label replaced by the newly respectful designation analytical. Combatants, intelligence briefings across species, began including assessments of human cognitive capabilities alongside traditional military strength evaluations. The shift represented more than semantic change. It acknowledged an entirely different approach to conflict that bypassed conventional power metrics. Diplomatic protocols were updated to account for this newly recognized strategic dimension, with negotiation tactics adjusting to address analytical capabilities alongside military
assets. Liana had authored an entirely new chapter in
Galactic Military Doctrine through demonstration rather than declaration. Her victory became required study at war colleges across systems, the combat footage serving as the foundational text for what analysts termed applied predictive conflict. The approach challenged centuries of assumptions about what constituted military advantage, suggesting that understanding an opponent's systems might outweigh overcoming their strength. Military theorists began debating whether this represented an evolutionary step in warfare or a fundamental redefinition of conflict itself. The emerging legend wasn't about the human who beat a warlord, but the one who demonstrated he could be beaten through means other than superior force. She became a case study in the weaponization of intellect. Her methods analyzed not as unique talent but as replicable methodology. Research papers explored the transferability of her approach across species and conflict scenarios, examining whether analytical combat represented a universal principle or human-specific adaptation. The focus shifted from celebrating individual achievement to understanding systemic application. Military research divisions established new branches dedicated to cognitive warfare development, with budgets shifting from hardware development to software and analysis capabilities. The realization spread that future conflicts might be won not by building better weapons, but by developing better understanding of how existing systems function and fail. The galactic balance of power began recalibrating around analytical capabilities rather than sheer destructive potential, a shift that would influence military investment and strategic planning for generations. The autopsy of one fight was rewriting the fundamentals of interstellar conflict theory. As the arena emptied, its vast space echoing with the fading sounds of 30,000 beings processing what they'd witnessed, Liana remained standing at the exact geometric center of the combat floor. The spotlights narrowed their focus until she stood in a single pool of light, a solitary figure in the cavernous space that had just hosted the most significant diplomatic upset in recent galactic history. Her breathing remained steady at precisely 12 inhalations per minute, the same rhythm she'd maintained throughout the confrontation, as if the physiological aftermath of paradigm-shifting combat required no more metabolic adjustment than a casual stroll. The silence felt different now, not the anticipatory quiet before violence, but the contemplative stillness after revelation. The scale of what she'd accomplished was only beginning to generate ripples outward through communication networks and diplomatic channels. On 17 different worlds, military analysts paused their playback of the combat footage to adjust their assessment parameters, realizing they'd been measuring the wrong variables entirely. The shift wasn't just about recalculating human capabilities. It involved rethinking fundamental assumptions about what constituted military effectiveness across species lines. Briefing documents that had taken generations to compile were suddenly obsolete, their carefully constructed assessments of galactic power dynamics rendered incomplete by a single demonstration of applied intellect. The galaxy now watched humanity with an entirely new quality of attention, not the paternalistic pity they'd previously afforded the so-called soft shells, but wary calculation reminiscent of strategists evaluating a previously underestimated competitor. The gaze felt different, carrying the weight of serious consideration rather than dismissive amusement. You could almost hear the collective recalibration happening across systems, the sound of established hierarchies being quietly but permanently rearranged. Diplomatic corps on 12 different homeworlds initiated emergency sessions to discuss the implications, their agendas suddenly requiring entirely new categories of analysis. The question was no longer whether humans belonged in galactic affairs. That matter had been decisively settled through demonstration rather than debate. The pressing issue became what humanity would choose to do with their newly acknowledged status. Would they leverage their analytical capabilities for expansion or cooperation? Would they seek to dominate or to integrate? The uncertainty created a subtle tension across diplomatic circles, the kind that emerges when a previously predictable variable suddenly demonstrates unexpected properties. Betting markets that had once focused on human defeat, percentages now offered odds on their first major diplomatic initiative. Post-recognition, Liana's victory represented a door opened rather than a destination reached, an opportunity rather than an accomplishment. She had proven that humanity's place in the galactic order would be earned not through mimicking established power structures, but through leveraging their unique cognitive approach to problem-solving. The demonstration suggested that sometimes the most effective way to join a game isn't to play by existing rules, but to introduce entirely new ways of keeping score. Her approach treated conflict as another system to be understood, rather than merely participated in, a perspective that would likely influence interstellar relations for generations. The conclusion of the fight felt less like an ending and more like a prelude to something far more complex. The real engagement was just beginning. The diplomatic maneuvering, the strategic positioning, the careful navigation of newly altered power dynamics. What had transpired in the arena was merely the opening move in a much larger and more intricate game, one that would be played across negotiation tables and treaty discussions rather than combat floors. The simplicity of physical conflict had been replaced by the complexity of interstellar politics, a transition that suited humanity's particular strengths rather well. As one particularly observant diplomat noted to her staff, this wasn't the end of a story but the beginning of something genuinely interesting. The soft shells had finally grown a brain in the galactic imagination, and now everyone had to decide whether that development represented a comfort or a threat. The answer would likely determine the next century of interstellar relations, with humanity's approach to their newfound status serving as the variable that could tilt the balance toward conflict or cooperation. The arena's lights dimmed gradually, but the implications of what had occurred there were only starting to brighten across the galactic stage. Liana's victory established a simple truth in a universe of overwhelming force. The ultimate advantage is a mind that calculates angles others don't see. Strength isn't defined by destruction, but by the precision to control outcomes, the insight to understand systems, and the strategic wisdom to choose restraint. The galaxy assumed it was watching another violent spectacle. In reality, they attended a lecture on applied intellect, where the syllabus included physics, psychology, and physiology. The lesson, delivered through movement rather than speech, was that humanity has only just begun to show its analytical capabilities.